Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
Heather Driscoll of Madison is a Democratic candidate in the 76th Assembly District. The primary is August 11th. Heather, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Steve.
Well, as I look over your campaign themes on social media, you talk about police officers getting out of schools, and the governor has recommended, as you know, a special session package dealing with minimum training standards for police, banning chokeholds, banning no-knock warrants, as I said, uniform standards. So can you give me your position on whether that package goes far enough, and why should police officers be removed from Madison's high schools?
Yeah, well, I do completely agree with that package, but I do also see a need for even deeper structural change in our system.
Okay.
We've seen, in areas where there have been reforms, that there still have been abuses of power. So I think, my line of thinking is that we're in a period of a lot of change, and there's an opportunity to reimagine the way we operate in the world and the way our systems are currently operating. So I agree with the governor's package, but I also would like to take a look at other ways that we could handle policing and think about, when there's situations where somebody's having a mental health crisis, really examine that and figure out if police are the best to respond in those situations. There have been programs that have been successful already that are happening in the nation, like in Eugene, Oregon. There's a program called Cahoots, and they receive about 24,000 calls in a year responding to a mental health crisis. And in only 1% of those calls, they had to call police for backup. And rather than having police respond in those situations, they had people who were trained in de-escalation and were able to best handle that situation and really understood how to handle it nonviolently and resolve the situations.
So those Wisconsin should explore changes like that, right?
Yeah, so I agree at looking at ways that we can reimagine our system.
Okay, let's go down a list of different subjects. If the governor's right and we're collecting $2 billion with a B less in taxes in this year because of the pandemic, boy, members of the assembly like you want to be tough choices: cut spending or raise taxes or fees. Your position?
Yeah, well, all governing requires balancing priorities, and I think it's really important that we don't mortgage our future by slashing investment in our students and our public education system. So to the extent that major budget cuts become necessary in our state budget, I believe we should avoid any attempts to pit critical needs like public education, welfare, healthcare, and other vital needs against each other. So in my opinion, I think we should look at other ways to reduce our spending, like massively reducing incarceration, stop spending money on highway expansions. Legalizing marijuana would create more money for our budget. And
so you would favor legalizing marijuana?
Yes.
Excuse me. Go ahead.
Yep.
You were considering different options.
Yeah, and also looking at restructuring the tax code so we can give public education and other programs like that the increased funding it deserves in a really difficult period right now where we're looking at cuts.
Okay. The next boundary lines for congressional districts and legislative districts, the Constitution says they'll be drawn by the party in power in the Capitol. The governor's recommended a People's Commission that would draft them and then forward them to elected officials. Is the governor right?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I 100% agree with an independent commission and having public hearings so we ensure that we have fair maps. Something similar to, what our neighboring state of Iowa has. And, it's really important that we don't have a situation where legislators are choosing their constituents and their voters, that it's the opposite, that voters are choosing their legislators.
Okay, let's talk about property taxes with a couple questions. Wisconsin property taxes, kind of the highest in the nation. That's one reason that school districts and local governments have their property tax levies capped. Now, you can exceed those caps with referendums, of course, and school districts have been successful in passing referendums. If you're a member of the assembly, should those caps stay in place to control property taxes, or is it time to get rid of them, please?
I think it's a challenging question, but I do think that I would err on the side of eliminating property tax caps. And it's also very important to control runaway costs for people who have more modest incomes. And so what I would propose is having like a circuit breaker model, which caps property taxes for people who make a certain amount of money.
Do local units of government, because they're so reliant on the property tax, is it time to consider alternative sources of revenue for them? Things like broadening the 5% sales tax to products and services that are now exempt, or even letting local governments levy a half-cent sales tax, something only counties can do now, please.
I would consider that if that's the direction that was really needed to increase the budget for education. But I think it's also a challenge because if we lowered property taxes for renters, that might not necessarily get passed on to them with the savings, but they still would have to be spending more on sales tax, and there could be a burden there. So, I think it's something that when I've knocked on doors prior to COVID-19 and spoken with a lot of people in the community and talked to people who were retired and single moms who were very worried about property tax being out of hand. And, so it's something to look at, and why I would think, having a situation where we have a cap for people who have fixed incomes, not raising it. And then with the sales tax, I would consider that if we can't get to the amount of funding that we need, that our education system really deserves.
Every 2 years when the legislature debates the biennial budget, there's a fight over how to stably fund our highways. Mm-hmm. Our gas tax, 30.9 cents per gallon, hasn't been raised in more than 10 years. The governor, last year recommended an increase. It didn't pass. Would you consider raising the gas tax, Heather?
Yeah, I think it is important to also invest that money in public transportation, and we massively need to have more transit available, like regionally and with bus rapid transit in cities.
Okay.
So I think it's necessary.
Okay, thank you. A couple questions on COVID. The pandemic has hit the economy and healthcare providers the state relies on. There's more demands on Medicaid. If you're in the assembly voting on the next state budget, should hospitals get a higher priority in that budget than perhaps they did in the budget that we're now operating under?
Well, I think it's really necessary that the hospitals, have what they need, especially in COVID-19, for testing and for contact tracing. And I also think that, for people right now who don't have health insurance, we should be using emergency powers granted by the federal government to deploy BadgerCare to guarantee that everybody has healthcare coverage during the pandemic. And it would make it possible so anyone who's hospitalized without health coverage can be immediately enrolled in BadgerCare.
Okay. Follow up on the pandemic. Should Wisconsin pass a law saying if you're a business that has followed the health and safety COVID regulations of WEDIC or Health Services or the CDC, you cannot be sued by someone who believes they may have contracted it on your property or working with your employee or something? Yeah,
I think that, the businesses need to be protected, especially when they're trying to do the right thing. And I think that we need to also be thinking about, how can we help them survive this pandemic? Because what we don't want to see is all these small businesses having to shutter their windows and shut down and corporations and chains being the one that survived this pandemic.
Okay, and another new subject. When a local government wants to authorize a major public works project, should there be standards and requirements giving preference to Wisconsin businesses? And let me give you some context. A study found that in 2015, out-of-state contractors were awarded $72 million in contracts for these local government public works projects, but that $72 million more than doubled to $146 million in 2018. So that's kind of the context. Preferences for Wisconsin businesses in local government public works projects?
Yeah, I do see a strong preference for Wisconsin. I think it's important to support Wisconsinites and the unions to make sure that we're providing adequate jobs for people here in Wisconsin and good livable wage jobs.
Thank you. In terms of livable wage, is it time to raise the minimum wage?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with raising the minimum wage to $15 per hour.
Okay. And when I interview candidates for the legislature from Madison and the Dane County, some of them have taken a position on the Air Force decision to expand the F-35As at Truax. Have you taken a position on that?
Yeah, my position is I don't agree with the F-35s being stationed here in Madison, particularly because of the racial disparities that we're seeing with the housing that's around the airport. We know that by having the F-35s there, that it would disproportionately impact low-income communities and communities of color and make those areas of housing incompatible for living, which I think is completely unacceptable.
Okay. From going to your campaign website, I know you've got a whole bunch of different issues out there. What issue haven't I asked you about that you consider really a key part of why you're running?
Yeah, another big one is climate change. I believe that right now we need really strong leadership and much more urgency than what we're seeing nationwide. And here locally and statewide, we've had some great leadership, having Governor Evers and committing to 2050 decarbonizing our electricity. But I think we need to take even more urgent action and commit to 100% renewable energy by 2030.
Another issue on your website is gun safety. What change in gun laws would you pursue if you're a member of the Assembly?
I've been as a gun violence survivor myself, I've been a strong advocate for background checks on every gun purchase and extreme risk protection orders, which would remove guns in a situation where somebody is a danger to themselves or to others. And those two laws would save hundreds and hundreds of lives. And we've seen data from other states. Once they've implemented that legislation, they've seen a reduction of people dying from gun deaths. Here in Wisconsin, suicide is even a greater issue than it is nationwide, because nationwide, about 2/3 of gun deaths are suicide, but here in Wisconsin, it's 71% of gun deaths are suicide. So it's something that the extreme risk protection orders could help reduce that level. And then the background checks on every gun purchase could keep guns from people who really shouldn't have them in the first place and who are right now being able to have access through loopholes, going to gun shows and ordering them online.
Okay, and then final question. The 76th is an open seat. It's attracted quite a crowd. Why are you the most qualified to win on August 11th?
Yeah, as we've talked about, there's a wide variety of issues that I'm very passionate about that I've worked on, and I've worked with the city and the county on several projects, as well as the school board. I worked with them on a 100% renewable energy resolution. I also have experience working in the Capitol on common sense gun laws with Moms Van Action as the Madison local legislative lead, as well as in Representative Chris Taylor's office. I worked on the Wisconsin Coalition for Gun Safety. So I have experience meeting with legislators and organizing advocacy days and advocating for changing laws. And that's something that experience I would bring with me and fight passionately without compromising my progressive values in the Capitol.
Thank you. Heather Driscoll of Madison is a Democratic candidate in the 76th Assembly District. The primary election is August 11. Heather, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heather.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.